and it is 2 p.m. UAE time. I am honoured and proud to welcome you all to the first secondary English webinar for British schools in the Middle East. My name is Susie Sheehan and I am Deputy Head at Modern English School in Cairo. I have previously been the Head of English in several school contexts, including a large comprehensive school in the UK, and also here at my current school, MES Cairo. Today's webinar is entitled Rapid Recovery, Preparing for Examinations. We are delighted to welcome our speakers today, Jamie Kirkcaldy from Oxford AQA and Lee Davis from Cambridge International. Before we start, I'd just like to make sure that everyone present is prepared for the webinar. I can see that everyone's muted their mics, which is excellent, thank you. And please do not unmute during the presentations as this may cause some sound interference. And also please keep your cameras switched off and please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. You are invited to use the chat bar on the right-hand side of your screen to post any questions that you may have at any point during the webinar. Our speakers will answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the session. After the webinar, the recording will be shared and any documents referenced will be saved in the shared resources area of the network discussion forums. Please do engage in the BSME network discussion forums and remember that you can participate in as many topics and subject areas as you wish. Colleagues can revisit today's webinar on the network page from next week. The video will be linked to the webinar flyer. Excellent, I think we're all prepared now. Jamie Kirkcaldy is our first speaker today. Jamie is the Head of Teaching and Learning Support at Oxford AQA. Before joining Oxford AQA, Jamie was Head of English at a large secondary school in Oxford and a member of that school's senior leadership team. He has a deep understanding of the challenges that schools and teachers face and is dedicated to supporting them. Jamie is going to outline how to make mocks count, which will be extremely useful to us all as we hurtle towards mock season. And he will give us tips on how to leverage the power of student data. Jamie Kirkcaldy, over to you.
Many thanks indeed, Suzanne. And good afternoon, I should say, to all of you. It's good morning here from Oxford, but it's a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Jamie Kirkcaldy, as Suzanne's already said, and I'm the Head of Teaching and Learning Support for Oxford AQA exams. And before that, as she was saying, I was a Head of English at a school here in Oxford, so I understand some of the challenges and some of the issues that you guys face in schools. And we're in, I think sort of we can almost stop the clock on the sweepstake before someone says these are unprecedented times, because it's almost impossible to have any conversation which doesn't involve that statement at some point. But they are very unprecedented times, and with that, you now have an enormous challenge in terms of the students that have started their GCSEs and A-levels are now moving into year 11 and year 13 in particular, who have missed a large chunk of their schooling through no fault of their own, and are now in a situation where you are all, building towards those exams and thinking about what you can do to catch up those students in the work or the schooling that they've missed. So we're in a situation where we are, like our students, coming back to class. But what I want to talk to you about today is to imagine not so much your experience of returning to class as a teacher, as I'm sure many of you have worked through the issues and the barriers and that pertain to that. I want you to imagine yourself as a student returning to class. But because I know I'm talking to English teachers, I want to shift you out of your comfort zone slightly and say, imagine returning to a maths class. I've also this sort of crazy notion that I sometimes wonder whether teachers shouldn't be allowed to teach the subject that they are good at, the subject they studied at university, because by definition, we all end up teaching subjects that we were, first of all, good at, and second of all, really enjoyed. And sometimes it's easier for us to lose perspective of the fact that for a number of people in our classroom, a number of our students, Ours is the subject they find difficult. Ours is the subject they don't get, that they find challenging, that they feel uncomfortable and lacking in confidence in. Just like we might have done in a science classroom or wherever it was at school that you felt nervous. So when you imagine you're in a maths class and the teacher stands at the front of the class and they put this on the board, they put on a maths question from this is a genuine GCSE maths question. They say to you, okay, right, when you complete this exam question, you've got 4 minutes, no talking, no questions, no mobile phones, no looking at notes, no chewing gum, no back chat, go. And I want you to think about your immediate emotional reaction to that, how you instantly feel a bit nervous and not quite sure. Now, there may be some very, very good mathematicians on this call. Some of you might look at that question and think, yep, leap straight in, know exactly what I want to talk about. But for many of you, you look at that and your mind goes blank and you don't really know where to start. Now I want you to secondary imagine the teacher.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jamie. Could we just
Hello?
click on the present now? Could you present the presentation?
Oh, I thought I had. I beg your pardon. Sorry.
I just thought I'd just check that we've done that.
My apologies.
Thank you.
Okay, my apologies. Sorry, there was a technical glitch there. So you've come to class and see this question on the board at the front. And this is you're told to complete this question. You've got 4 minutes. That clock starts ticking. You're under pressure, and maybe your mind goes blank. At that point, the teacher says, "Okay, now you've finished. You've had your 4 minutes. Here is your self-assessment grid. There's 2 methods you could have answered this question, and the answer you should have got is 61.60. And you're looking at your paper. Maybe you got the question right. Maybe you got the question wrong. But before you've even had time to draw breath, the next question is on the board, and it says, "Now complete this exam question." And you're told if you've got the last question right, make sure you get this question right as well. And if you've got the last question wrong, well, make sure you do this question better.
Jamie, I'm awfully sorry to interrupt you again, but for some reason we still can't see your presentation. So I think we'll just pause because we all want to see the questions. We'll pause until it's fixed on the screen.
Oh, I've got a thing here saying can't show your screen. Sorry, an error curve and screen saving. I will try that again.
Okay, no
See
problem.
if we can work through this. Is everyone seeing that now?
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you, Jamie. I shall mute again.
So to recap, apologies for the technical hitches, everybody. You've come to your maths class. You've been given a question to complete in 4 minutes. You're under that kind of exam pressure straight away. You then have your self-assessment that you need to go through, and you get the right answer or you get the wrong answer. You're then given a second question, and you're told if you've got the last question right, we'll get this one right as well. If you've got the last question wrong, we'll make sure you do this question better. And my question to you is, who actually is this fundamentally helping? You've got a group of students who might have been successful in this task, but they haven't necessarily gained any new insight or new information about their performance. And you've got a group of students who have been unsuccessful in this task, who've got no insight into actually why they haven't succeeded and what they can do to succeed next time. And this is the process that I think a lot of us historically have been through. And I certainly think back to my kind of early days in teaching. This is what mock exams often felt like to me, both as a student when I was at school and certainly as a teacher setting mock exams for my students. We have this belief sometimes that if we make students endlessly sit past papers, then they will somehow intrinsically and almost osmotically get better at them. And I think it's almost like, you take a teenager, you put them in a car, and you just make them do the driving test over and over and over again until they pass. Without effective intervention, without some kind of strategy to build the skills they need to be successful, you could actually end up doing not only not actively helping those students, but you could actively reduce their chances of being successful. They can ingrain bad habits, and particularly they can undermine confidence. And again, I want you to think about the lessons and the parts of school that you struggle with as a teenager, the lessons where you lacked confidence. If this was the approach taken, if you were simply made to take endless practice papers over and over again, what improvements do you think you would see in your own performance? Now, that is not to say that past papers and mock exams are not an integral part of preparing students for exam, because of course they are. We all know that exam technique is as important as subject knowledge when it comes to being successful in an exam. And we need to make sure students have that exam technique really sort of very confident in that exam technique. So let's think about what an exam actually is. I used to say this to my students an awful lot. The exams are not a test of what you know, they are a test of what you can prove that you know to the examiner under exam conditions. And there are two main constraints within an exam: time and access to information. Students under a time constraint, they have to demonstrate their knowledge in a set amount of time, and they don't have access to their notes, they don't have access to any revision materials that would help them in that scenario. Now, this is true of all exams, and anyone involved in assessment design will tell you that the exams are designed to be absolutely fair and absolutely rigorous, but they can only test what is in that exam paper. What you have now are two variables that you as a teacher can control in order to build that exam technique: the time and access into information. And I think what's really key in terms of making mock exams a more effective strategy for students, helping them prepare for real exams, is to think about it as a phased approach. So rather than giving that student the mock exam, sit them down and say, right, off you go, you've got an hour and a half in silence and I'll take them at the end of the lesson and mark them. Let's start off with open time and open book. So students have an exam paper, or more likely an exam question or a small section from an exam. Say, okay, I want you to complete this question or this set of questions. There's no time limits. You take as long as you need. You can have your notes open in front of you. Maybe even say you can share and discuss with the person next to you if you think that would be appropriate in your classroom. But give them time to build their skills with access to the information that they need to begin with. As you then work through this process, you can gradually reduce or control the variables at hand. So the next time they do a set of questions, you can look at the performance on that first set, maybe offer some feedback, give pointers on where they can make improvements. Now take away the notes. So they're now having to work autonomously, but without the time constraints. Third stage, you now again allow access to notes, but you bring in the idea of time constraints. So now we're building in not just can you prove your subject knowledge, but can you now prove it under time pressure? But we've removed the other pressure of not having access to your notes. So you look at that access to information and that time constraint in two separate scenarios. Then finally, we can build up towards a more lifelike exam scenario where it's unlimited time and without access to notes. And crucially, don't start with whole exam papers. Start with individual questions or start with individual sections and gradually build up the skills so that as you can gradually build towards sitting full exam papers. Students that I've taught over the years have found this a much more effective method in terms of building the skills they need to be successful, because it takes that instantaneous pressure off in terms of, right, now you've got to go into exam conditions. It allows them to build skills more slowly, more gradually. And if you think about how you learn absolutely anything, this is an intrinsic way that people approach this. People don't learn to play tennis by just playing tennis matches. They get individual parts of that broken down without the pressure of competition. And that's exactly the same approach we should be looking at preparing students for exams. Another element that I think is really important that teachers can bring into their teaching practice is the idea of modeling. And I often refer to this as walking the walk. This can be a really powerful technique, especially I think in English, where a lot of the answers are more extended. You as a teacher, showing how you would answer a question live in the classroom. So you put the question up on the board maybe, you talk to students about what skills are being tested and how much time in an exam you would expect them to dedicate to that question. You then put yourself under that pressure. You start the clock and you demonstrate how it should be done. But crucially, it isn't just a case of you writing an answer while they watch you. You can demonstrate the thinking process that you're going through. So you might say, okay, now I'm going to bring in some textual support to support my ideas, because I need to make sure that my ideas are supported by language devices from the text. I'm now going to talk about particular language devices and the impact they have. So students can actually start to think about what's going on inside the head of someone who's constructing a top mark response. And what that means is that they can transpose that approach to questions that test the same skill but in a different context. Because once they've understood the thought process, they can then apply that thought process to other questions that are similar but address different subject matter. To take this one step even further, something that I know a number of schools have started doing the last few years, and something that we trialed very successfully in my school before I entered this role, are walking, talking mock exams. So if you've got to the stage now where students are at a stage where they should be able to be constructing effective exam responses in the allotted time, rather than put everyone in the exam hall, get them to a mock exam on exam conditions, take it in the market, think about actually going through an entire exam paper question by question. And this is particularly useful, again, for English, which tends to have fewer questions, but of longer duration than, say, a maths or a science paper. What that allows you to do is teach students how to approach each individual question type. Because we know in an English exam, there are particular question types that need to be answered in a particular way, that your strategy will depend on the skills that are being tested in that question. This can be very easily done. So in my school, we had a large exam hall. We had a big screen at the end. We set up a PowerPoint presentation that went through that mock exam paper. We'd say, okay, this is question 1. These are the skills that are being assessed. We put up a model answer of a question, similar question from a different exam paper. We weren't giving them the answer, but we're demonstrating what a good answer kind of looked like. We then said, you should spend X number of minutes on this question. And then they would complete the question in that time. So they're still having that exam experience. They're still sat in an exam hall with that sense of the exam hall pressure. They were under time constraint. They didn't have access to their notes. But just they were going into that question, they had a very clear idea of how to successfully approach that question. What we then found for a lot of students, and again, I'm sure you'll think of students that this reflects in your own school, it was the first time a lot of them had actually completed an entire exam. We know that time management is an issue for a lot of students in exams, especially in an English exam where a lot of the higher mark questions come towards the end of the exam paper. How many times have you marked an exam paper and students have either not completed the last question at all, or written 4 or 5 lines because they ran out of time because they spent too much time on the questions, the lower tariff questions at the beginning of the exam paper? And the number of marks students lose through poor time management is staggering. But also, it undermines that confidence further. If they feel they can't even complete the exam in the time available, that is a really, really nerve-wracking idea. When they go into the real exam thinking, well, last time I didn't even finish this exam, how on earth am I going to be successful in this one? So we found that gave students real confidence moving into the real exam. It also gave us as teachers far more information about their skills and strengths and weaknesses, because if they haven't completed or only completed a few lines of the last question, we as a teacher can't actually tell if they have got the skills in that question type or not. We haven't got complete information. So we used to run a walking, talking mock exam in November. In January, beg your pardon, and then another mock exam in March that was under exam conditions entirely without that scaffold. So we're gradually taking that scaffold and that support away from our students. And what it means is they can see that technique and the timings in context. So we used to take them we used to do this in the exam hall, so it felt like an exam. We didn't do it in the classroom, so it had that same status and same kind of credibility of an exam, but in a supporting environment. The next thing I'd recommend is actually making students the examiner. If we look at the 2 maths questions that I started this session with, you'll notice that, yes, they're talking about different things. One's about paint and one's about airline tickets, but effectively, it's the same mathematics that's being tested. It's the same style of question. And questions generally have a degree of, are generic to a certain extent. They call this in exam assessment design good predictability, that students can't predict what the content of an exam is going to be, but the style in which questions are asked shouldn't really come as a surprise. What that means is that once students understand how questions are constructed, and they understand the rubric and the style of questions, it becomes fairly easy for them to actually create their own exam questions. So you can identify specific skills or question types, maybe ones that students have been struggling with in the past. And you can set parameters. You might say, okay, I want you to write a question that tests this skill it's going to worth this marks, and I want you to ask this in this question format. So you can actually have that dialogue around exam rubric and exam design with students, and that really empowers them, because when they get to an exam, they look at a question and go, oh, this is one of those questions. That's testing these skills, and therefore I need to apply this technique in this scenario. So the more they understand about exam construction, the more confident they will be when they have to sit an exam themselves. They then create the questions and potentially even create mark schemes, or use a generic mark scheme from a past paper if that would be more effective. They could do this individually, they could do this in pairs, it could be a homework they bring to the lesson. What you could even do is break the an exam down to its component parts and allocate different sections to different students within the class or different groups within the class, and create a class mock exam. What that means is obviously is when you have that mock exam, going forward, you then have a mock exam you could potentially use with other classes in the future. Or you could take that mock exam which they've created and do some of the work we've looked at so far and build up the exam technique, or use it as a walking, talking mock exam. So it becomes effectively a self-perpetuating cycle where you create resources that you can then use with those students very successfully. The last thing I want to touch on, so far we've looked very much at the build up to exams and very much the student experience of building up to exams, and what we as teachers can do to make that build up to exams an empowering experience for students. What I think is really, really crucial, and something that I talk about a lot with teachers and a lot with schools, and I know something that's very important to schools across the world, is what you actually do with the information that mock exams gives you. What are the results telling you? And data analysis is absolutely key to this. Now, again, traditionally, if we think about how our understanding of data and how our understanding how data is used has changed over the years, it's got so much more sophisticated. When I first came into teaching, really, sort of mock exams just gave you an idea of which students got which marks, what grade we thought that meant, and therefore which students we felt were underperforming, which students might need a bit of extra help or a bit of a sort of kick up the backside, essentially. What we're doing increasingly now is actually looking beyond those headline figures and looking at where those where the performance is strong, where the performance is weak, and specifically where we need to target our intervention in terms of helping that student. So you can break it down against different aspects of the exam. The most obvious ones being assessment objectives, question types, curriculum content, and particular skills. So, for example, we're in the process of creating a mock exam analyzer tool for our GC English as a second language qualification, which does a lot of this kind of work automatically. But a relatively simple spreadsheet can give you quite similar information. So if I've got on screen here what sort of a mock set of data for an imaginary class. This class is just 4 people, obviously, just for the sake of our presentation. Now, what that immediately gives us is a question by question breakdown of student performance. And I've red, amber, greened it to look at where the strengths and weaknesses are within that cohort. Now, how you assign performance is kind of up to you as a school. You might want to do it just purely on attainment. Students with high marks would be green, low marks would be red, and students in the kind of the middle band would be orange. You can track it, as we used to, off predicted grades. So if we have students working at different levels, especially if you have quite a mixed cohort of students, as I know a lot of you do, you might want to say, well, actually, for this student, this mark could be successful, but for this student who's got a much higher predicted grade, that would be an underperformance. So you can collate and you can color code your data with great subtlety and nuance, depending on the cohort you're dealing with. You can also break it down by assessment objectives. If you look at a mark scheme for an English paper, it will tell you what assessment objectives are being assessed in each question. So rather than just say, oh, they did question 2 successfully, or question 3 successful, or whatever it might be, you can start to use that information to say, well, actually, what they're lacking is this question, this skill, and this skill. That's where we need to focus our teaching and learning between the mock exam and the real exam. And this is particularly crucial in the situation that we are all in now, where we've got a bunch of students coming back from a period of being outside of school, of remote teaching and learning, where we haven't got as much information as we would like on their performance and their skill levels. So if we're bringing students back into the classroom, as I know you all are, you'll probably want to be doing some assessment of those students to see where they are, bearing in mind the school that they've missed over the last 6 months. Once you have that information, once you've got some data in terms of their performances, you can then analyze that data to say, okay, we've got, you know, a relatively short amount of time between now and the final exams. These are the areas we most need to target. And it's by targeting those specific areas of strengths and weakness that you can see significant improvements in student outcomes in the real exam. But also, as with so much of what I'm talking about today, it's also about improving student confidence and their sense of empowerment. If you say to a student, oh, you got this grade and you need to improve by 7 marks to get the next grade up, which is your predicted grade or the grade that you want or you're aspiring towards, does that student know where those 7 marks are coming from? If we just turn around to a student and say, do what you did, but do it better. So next time you need to improve. Does that actually mean anything to them? If they don't know how to improve, if they don't know where they need to make those improvements, how can they possibly make those steps forward that we want for them? So it's really about saying to a student, this is what you need to do to improve. One thing I used to say to my students was, rather than think about how you get an extra 9, 10 marks, think about if you improved 1 mark on each question in that exam, what would that mean to you overall? And once you know that, once you say, okay, well, to improve that 1 mark in this question, you need to adjust this. If you move by 1 mark in this question, you need to adjust that. This is the strength and weakness that you've got. Or engage them with a discussion about assessment objectives. You're really struggling with reading skill 3. Here's what that means. Here's the skill that you need to improve. If you were to improve that skill, that would improve your performance across all the question types and enable you to increase that grade in the way that you want to. So that's my little pitch in terms of how you can use mock exams more effectively in your school context, how you can use them to build skills, how you can use them to build confidence, rather than just making students endlessly sit practice papers and just hoping they're going to understand intuitively how to improve. I know we're going to have questions at the end of the session after Lee's presentation. So I look forward to any questions you have for me on that topic or indeed any other topic. And if there's something that occurs to you after the session, you think, oh, I really wish I'd asked that, my email is on the screen there. And I know that Suzanne is going to share these slide decks with you all afterwards. If there's something you want to follow up with me about or a question you have, please do drop me an email. I'll be more than happy to talk to you. Many thanks for your time and for your attention and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today and for inspiring us. You have alerted us all to how powerful it can be to scaffold exam responses for our students. And you've reminded us of the very positive impact that using data strategies can have on student results. Thanks again, Jamie. We will come back to you hopefully with some questions at the end. I would now like to introduce Lee Davis. Following strategic leadership roles at the IBO and at the Aga Khan Academies, Lee Davis joined Cambridge Assessment International Education as Interim Director for Teaching and Learning, where he is responsible for teacher and leader development initiatives. Lee is going to talk to us today about study habits and about approaches to learning as tools to accelerate achievement. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you, Suzanne. I will just put my slides up. And there we go. Can you just confirm, Suzanne, that you can see those, please? Verbally, if that's okay, because I can't see any chat.
One moment, I shall double check. Yes, we can see. Thank you, Lee.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Jamie, as well, actually, for presenting on something that I think is really important. And it's, whilst you gave a very specific example around examination performance, really what we're looking to do here is to activate our student thinking and also their metacognitive capability. And I think it's about getting them to think, but also to getting them to think really hard. And of course, that will be more or less challenging depending on the students you have in front of you. We are in this time of COVID, and we are moving back into schools after a time of disruption and lockdown. So really, there is a clear challenge here to try and accelerate that learning as quickly as possible. And I'm going to talk about why that's important and then how you might go about it, particularly in terms of a sort of an English language, English literature context. Okay, so I'm going to define some terms initially, and then I'm going to look at the strategies that you may be able to use in your classroom. Some of them you may know already. Some of them may connect to some of your existing practice, but it's about sort of expanding upon that, I think, and hopefully giving you something to consider as you go back into your classrooms hereafter. Let's try and tune in a little bit though, and I'm going to give you an English language example. This is a poem by Sylvia Plath called You're, and what I'd like you to do, please, is I'm going to show the poem in a moment. I'd like you to then figure out what it's actually talking about. What's the subject matter of this poem? I'm going to give you 1 minute only to do it. Normally in a workshop we give more time to discuss it afterwards, but just 1 minute for you to read through the poem and for you to figure out what the subject matter is of this particular poem. Okay, I'm going to stop you there, unfortunately. But for those of you who do know this poem, of course, it's a reminder of how well Sylvia Plath writes. But for those of you who don't know it, I'm going to put you out of your misery. She's writing about the unborn baby growing inside her. But as you have read through it, you will be thinking to yourselves, well, okay, how do I figure this out? How do I actually be successful in the task that Leah set us? So you probably reread the poem, if you had a chance to do so. If I gave you further time, you would have perhaps looked up challenging words that you weren't quite clear about. You would have looked for clues in the text, and you would have tried to make connections to what you already know. Perhaps you would have read the poem out loud to yourself, and that would have helped unlock some of the imagery that's contained here. And perhaps you would have gone deeper into some of the phrases or the lines. The point being is that you knew what success looked like in this task, which was to figure out what Sylvia Plath was writing about. And you, as an adult, would have had strategies to try and be successful in that task, and you would have monitored them as you went along. Reading out aloud didn't quite work, so I'm going to have to dig more deeply into this. Perhaps you would have worked out that from the 4th of July to All Falls Day, 1st of April, it was 9 months. And maybe that was a clue into what this poem was about. As I say, as an adult, we have these strategies and they come naturally to us, developed over a longer period of time. But our students don't necessarily do this. And it's that I'd like to really sort of talk about now for the rest of this presentation. So let's define our scope and terms. What might help here, first of all, is this is a report that was produced by a cross-disciplinary team here in Cambridge, which consisted of psychiatrists, epidemiologists, educationalists, economists, and neuroscientists. And it was a report through to an education committee here in the UK, and they were saying, okay, COVID's going to cause these 3 key issues. The loss of face time and schooling will negatively impact children's achievement, even though there's a lot of research out there around disasters and emergencies, talking particularly about bushfires in Australia, for example, or the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, where actually periods out of school didn't necessarily bring about those negative impacts on children's achievement. But we do think that's going to be the case as a result of this pandemic. So this is something that for policymakers, school leadership, teachers, they obviously have to take in mind. Socioeconomic disparities will widen during periods of lockdown. So the problems that already exist, if there are differences between a student's home life and background, the resources that they have available to them, the support they have available to them at home. This will also cause significant problems during a time out of school. But it's this third area around children with cognitive disadvantages that will make a slow restart that I'd like to then focus in on. Okay. David Perkins from the Graduate School of Education in Harvard came up with a really good sort of useful model actually to sort of start categorizing our students in our class, particularly in the area of metacognitive learning and thinking hard about their sort of learning approaches to learning. So the first area, first sort of category is around tacit. And these are students who essentially just accept whether they know something or not. They come up often, you'll recognize these students, they would come up with answers that you think, what on earth has driven that student to that answer? How did they come up with that? That just doesn't relate to what we're actually talking about. They just simply know, they simply just accept whether they know something or not.
I'm awfully sorry to interrupt you, Lee. We seem to be experiencing those sound problems again.
Ah, okay, I'm so sorry. Is this better?
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you.
Okay, I will come up a little bit closer.
Keep it like that. Yeah, thanks.
Students who are more aware have some strategies in their locker. They can actually sort of approach a task with some idea of how to do it, but they don't think strategically about a particular task, and they may have gaps in their knowledge and understanding. The more strategic learners do have these approaches. They learn formulas and methods, but sometimes they might flounder in unfamiliar or sort of unknown or new contexts. So really what we're trying to do is drive students towards a more reflective approach to learning. And that really speaks now to some of the metacognitive practices that we're going to be talking about. Okay, just sort of give you a sense of this. Here is a piece of writing actually from a student. And I'm going to ask you where you might place this student on that continuum that Perkins has provided for us. To what extent is this a tacit student, an aware student, a strategic student, or a reflective student? I'll just give you a moment to read what the student has written. So again, if we were in a workshop, I would ask you to start thinking about this a little bit and talking to the person next to you. But you may think, okay, they seem to have used adverbial starters. They seem to know what they are. Have they used them very strategically, or have they just sort of put them in? Perhaps they're sort of between the aware and the more strategic, on that continuum of metacognitive learners that Perkins was talking about here. And again, this may resonate with some of your own students in your class. Okay, if we go a bit deeper on cognitive capability, we often find, and this is from research that Duncan Astle and his team have done at the Cognition and Brain Research Unit here in Cambridge, that students fall into four sort of general groups in terms of cognitive ability. There is the age-typical cognitive ability, so the sort of your average student. There are children with broad cognitive difficulties, particularly, and this is sort of, there's a comorbidity, there's a co-occurrence problem here around reading, spelling, mathematical problems, and so on. There are children with working memory problems or short-term memory problems. And then there are children with phonological difficulties as well. So this is broadly speaking around their speech impairments. What they're finding is that these students, particularly in those bottom three categories, tend to have a learning profile that is at least one standard deviation below expected levels on any learning measure that you can use. And this often translates ultimately, unfortunately, into IGCSE 1 or 2 grades lower than C. So you can see that students with cognitive difficulties will be our biggest challenge in this environment. Okay. So what we're trying to do then is we're trying to develop metacognitive capability in our our students. And this is really what we want to see. We want them to be able to plan, monitor, evaluate, and make changes to their own learning behaviors. And there are two aspects to this. One is around metacognitive knowledge, so their knowledge about the task and their knowledge about themselves as learners. And then secondly, this regulation piece, so they're monitoring and making changes to their learning if they're seeing that it's not actually successful. Okay, hidden in these slides actually is more detail on this, but I'd like to move on if that's okay. Why is it important? Well, just to give you a sense here, if you look on the top left-hand side of this table, the first four strategies here, which have the highest effect size, so the highest sort of size of the effects, the impact on student learning, reciprocal teaching, feedback, teaching students to self-verbalize, and metacognitive strategies have the highest effect sizes here. And I certainly encourage you to start looking at some of the research which supports developments in this area. And similarly, the Education Endowment Foundation, and I've highlighted this now, if you start introducing metacognitive capabilities and developments in your students, then you're going to see up to 8 months of progress over a class of students, for example, who did not follow these strategies. So you can see again, when we're looking at a time of accelerating learning and accelerating student progress, that strategies like this have a real impact. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Okay, so in this particular example, what we're asking the student to do is to summarize and restate from a piece of prose, from a piece of text that they have. And in this particular case, this was a task that the students were looking at around Goodnight, Mr. Tom. And the prose itself was around two protagonists being on a beach and looking out to the sea. And the text was full of imagery and sensory imagery around the sea. And what the students were then asked to do was take key words and phrases that were in the prose and then make a poem out of it. And what you can see, and there are a number of ways you can do this. Obviously, the students can actually write down the key phrases and sort them. Or what teachers often do is actually give some of the text itself on a piece of paper, and the students can cut out key words and phrases, and then they can start manipulating them into a particular poem. We call this an ekphrastic exercise in the sense of creating one form of art from another, in this case from prose to poetry. But what they're doing here is they're getting the key meaning and they're sort of summarizing and restating for others. This is just another example, so where the students have actually written some of the key phrases out for themselves on pieces of paper, and then they were able to manipulate them to think about, does this actually create something that reflects what they've actually seen in the text. Another approach, of course, is around what a good one looks like, so waggle, what a good one looks like. And here is a rounders activity. So the task here was, there was a piece of text, it was a description about a place, and then students were asked to think about why it's a strong description about a place, and write on the outside of that their thinking, their thoughts about this. And they were asked to think about word choice, sentence style, imagery, and the appeal to their senses. And they were asked to think about why they think it's good phrasing, good sentences that sort of bring this out, draw this out. And what the students do then is they go round. So different tables will have different pieces of text, and then the students actually see what others have written, add to that, and then add anything new that they think is important. You will have checklists, I'm sure, which outline success criteria. Here's one for writing a play script. What's always interesting, of course, with these things is that I think I could get the same marks as Shakespeare just by using this particular checklist. So you can see it has strengths, but also limitations. Okay. This is what's called a walking chocolate bar, and some of you may have seen this before. So the students are asked to take a piece of A4 paper, fold it in half again, and then in half again, and you create 8 segments on that piece of paper. And then what you're doing is you're looking at the task in hand. So in this case, what are the rules for using capital letters? And what they will do is they will start writing some of these for themselves, and then they will start exchanging with others in the class. And again, that's hence the walking part of the chocolate bar. Obviously, you can use this with any type of activity. So you could sort of look at what are the main phrases or quotes from a text that capture a book's themes, for example, or character development. You can make this as sophisticated as you so wish. What's also nice is, and when we worked with this teacher, when she did this with her class, not only does it illustrate sort of what a good one looks like in this particular case, but it also draws out the neurodiverse learner. So I'll show you an example of that now. So this was the same task, the same activity, but just interpreted differently by the student. And here, you'll notice how the student folded the paper this time, still got 8 segments to complete, but wrote very different things in them. There are a couple there that you might want to pick out. So use capital letters when writing the words, capital letters. So he's thinking very differently here. Do not use them in graffiti. Use them when writing explosion words on sparkly paper, for example. So you can see how it draws out some very different thinking. But again, the idea here is to get the students thinking hard. Okay. Essentially what we're trying to do then is develop metacognitive talk in the classroom. And here's just a very sort of quick way of trying to sort of establish that. Here we're sort of saying, okay, what questions could students ask themselves before any given task or activity, during the task, and then after the task? And they may look something like this. So before the task, is this something similar to something that they've seen before? What do I want to achieve? Success looks like this. What should I do first? During the task, am I on the right track? What can I do differently if I'm not? Who can I ask for help? And obviously strategies like C2 or C3 students before me, for example, before the teacher. After the task, well, what worked well? What could I have done better? Can I apply this to other situations? So that moving the student away from not just being a strategic learner, but more towards reflective. Okay, just heard from Jamie actually around how you can approach the examination process and exam papers in particular. Lovett introduced the concept of exam rapids. So this is where you're asking students to reflect before and after an exam or test on study habits, time spent on topics, deliberate practice, and so on. And you can also get them, as Jamie suggested, give paper to annotate rather than just do. Okay. So if you're interested in doing this in your class, or you're interested in taking this further, here's a quick checklist for you. So ask your students to identify their learning goals and to think about how they plan to meet those goals. It's really important you get them to verbalize this, perhaps even write it down. Get them to monitor how well that task is doing. And if it's going wrong, what could they do, first of all, to prevent anything from happening? So thinking about it beforehand. But then if it's going wrong during the task itself, what can they do to change it? Evaluation, of course. So how did they do on the task, and how could they improve their performance in future tasks? And give the students the opportunity to use these new strategies, both with support and independently. So again, the scaffolding that Jamie talked about, and then more independent learning thereafter. Okay, and ultimately, of course, it's about supporting the classroom environment to provide the right learning environment for this to happen. So you're encouraging students to verbalize their thinking. You're modeling it yourself. And again, picking up on some of the things that Jamie said here, model thinking out loud, and you'll encourage the students to do this too. Okay. Just to finish off on this quote, but also to sort of highlight and pinpoint some key resources for you that we've produced. They're all in this slide deck. So there are some things here around teaching and learning when the school returns, which we produced for you. There are links here around getting started with metacognition and education briefs. There are videos for you to look at and podcasts. Obviously, Dylan William has something to say. If you're interested in effect sizes or the explanation of effect sizes and the impact, measuring impact of these strategies, then please have a look at that. Thinking aloud and the solo approach that Pam Hook has developed, which is similar in this, and then there are websites and books as well. So I'm going to finish there, and then I think that should give us time for questions. Thank you very
much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. I'm wondering have you stopped presenting?
Yes, I should have stopped presenting. Is that
perfect? Thank you, Lee. Thanks again. We've been reminded about how loss of face-to-face schooling has negatively impacted so many of our learners, and you have outlined for us a range of the challenges that so many young people face, and have helped us to understand those challenges, and therefore we will improve as teachers as a result of your presentation. I particularly like the walking chocolate bar strategy, which I never heard of before, and the metacognition checklist shared at the end was particularly useful, along with all the resources and the links. Thank you, inspiring and extremely useful. Do we have any questions for our speakers today? I think the best way to, if you could actually have a question, if you could turn your camera on, you're welcome to join in the discussion and fire away. I can't see any questions in the chat bar. Hi, Catherine, over to you. You need to unmute. Yeah, excellent.
Hi, some very interesting things from both of you, and certainly things that I will take away. However, we do have our students back. They've started back this week, and we have year 11, 12 and 13 at the moment, and year 10 are coming back on Sunday. However, a lot of the strategies that you're talking about requires the children or students to be able to move around the room, physically hold paper, and sort of interact with each other. And we're not at that stage yet. We are 1.5 meters apart. We've got 15 in a class. We're all in mixed ability classes now because I had to mess around with the classrooms. And a lot of those strategies we can't use. Do you have any suggestions of how we can do them? Because we're essentially still online, but just with the students in front of us. So do you have any strategies that we can use that sort of cross over that?
Yeah, shall I take that first, Suzanne? Is that okay? Okay. So yes, and Catherine, absolutely, context is everything. And so yes, assumptions are so that sort of students are in bubbles, but clearly that's not the case in your case. So you're not choosing to do that, and therefore it's separation. I think this is really then where you are going to need digital technologies to support this if you're looking for collaboration. As I say, if it's something where it's a think and then pair with somebody who's relatively close to you, then clearly you can do some of these things. So you can show, you can work on larger pieces of paper, for example. But obviously, if it's about building knowledge and understanding together, you're going to have to use technologies to support that. And I don't know what's possible or what's available for you here. So the walking chocolate bar can obviously be done on a sort of a collaborative workspace, for example, digitally, but I don't know what you've got available actually to do that. But it's the concept more than anything I think I want to stress, rather than the it's like this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, I think to build on that, I think if you look at, I think in terms of both our presentations, I think Lee is absolutely right that what we're looking at is almost a mindset shift as much as a sort of, do X, Y, or Z as a strategy. I think, in terms of if you look at the challenges that are facing teachers all across the world right now, it is exactly as you outline. How do I take, all teaching effectively is an interactive exercise. How do we suddenly take this thing that's worked like this for hundreds, thousands of years and do it in a completely different way almost overnight? And I'm incredibly impressed and in awe of what all teachers everywhere are doing to adapt to this. But I think it's very much about the idea. I think, you know, if you look at metacognition, you look at sort of some of the exam prep stuff I was going through, there's very much a crossover there in terms of it's about helping students actually understand their own performance and actually be able to take a step back from what they're doing and understand, you know, sort of the context and understand their strengths and weaknesses and be able to deconstruct their work so they can improve going forward. And you know, all these strategies are things that can be adapted to the current context in terms of you know, feedback and you know, teacher modeling. I think will be really, really critical. I think probably more than any strategy going forward, I think that might be the most critical one of all, is teachers actually going through and constructing models of what effective work looks like and unpicking that model for students. I think in a situation where you can't have that same level of one-to-one interaction with students, I think that is going to have a really increased role going forward for students. And very best of luck to you.
You're on mute, Suzanne.
I was thanking Jamie and thanking Lee for answering Catherine. Catherine, I'm wondering where you're based.
I'm at Cranley in Abu Dhabi.
Ah, yes. And it's interesting because although we are British Schools of the Middle East, there are so many different models of learning happening across the region. And I think that what Lee and Jamie have both advised is that we use their advice and their strategies and their tips in a generic way and adapt it to whatever technologies we have. And it's a really good thing to take back to your team, isn't it? Take back to the team and work out together how we can best use these incredibly useful strategies. I'm wondering if John had a question. John, are you still with us?
I'm still here.
Please go ahead.
I mean, in a way, it's quite it's allied to Catherine's question, really. It's we're in a position where we have year 10s for the first time ever. We've just rolled this out as a new thing. So I've got students who are new to the whole idea of a GCSE program, and I haven't seen them physically since March, and I might see them in November. I might not see them till January. And I'm thinking of what are the specifics that Lee and Jamie think I should be considering for my students. Maybe not the strategies so much, but what if I'm caring for my students, looking after my students, what should I be doing first to make sure that they're in a position to make the most of this? And we have dodgy internet, children who can barely connect during our live lessons. So I'm thinking, what do I do to scaffold everything about the lessons? And this isn't necessarily an English question either. I'm the curriculum lead for our senior school. So if you think there are things that are particularly true for science, maths, equally interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, John, what you're facing there is an incredibly challenging situation by anyone's yardstick, as you know, as so many teachers are. I think in your position, where you've got a situation where students are coming back with different levels of engagement, not necessarily through any fault of their own, in terms of, as you said, you mentioned their varying internet connectivity and so forth. In your position, one of the first things I'd be thinking about as any teacher or head of department would be, where are those students at? I think first thing I need is an accurate picture of where they are. Now, there's a very delicate balance to strike there, because what you don't want to do is say, right, day one, welcome back, here's a test. You know, sort of, you know, there is a massive well-being issue here that we really need to be careful and mindful of, and I'm sure that's foremost in your mind at the moment. You know, but at the same time, we do need to have some clear picture of where students are at. So I would be looking at starting, you know, very slow, very gentle kind of assessment process in that first couple of weeks. Not as I say, sit down and do a mock exam, but a certain sort of, okay, first of all, a self-reflection. Where do you as a student think you are? And that can be multifaceted. I'd absolutely have, you know, how's your well-being? How's your mental health in that conversation? How do you feel about coming back to school? What is making you nervous? What is making you anxious? What are you feeling confident about? So you have a holistic view of that student in terms of where they are as a person, where they are in terms of what they feel their level of confidence is in that particular subject, or what, you know, whether that's math, science, English, or whatever. And then building on from that, I'd have some gentle bleed into, okay, well, let's get some benchmark assessment. And I wouldn't use that term benchmark with them, but I'd say, you know, let's have a skills audit. Let's have a look at where people are. So you as a teacher can identify, okay, because you're looking at a situation where you're going to have quite a short space of time, you know, between, you know, the students coming back and if they're you say they're year 10, so they're starting their first year of GCSE. So they've missed a chunk of Key Stage 3. Now, I'm sure you've done an awful lot to try and support them remotely during that time, but we know from what you've told us that's hit and miss. What you'd want to know is, okay, where are the skills gaps so I can identify and plan my teaching and learning. I would then possibly sit down as a department, collate that information, so you've got an overarching view of where that cohort is, and then I'd bleed that into my curriculum planning in terms of, okay, what do we need to do in the next 6 months before the end of this academic year, then building forward to the next year, and engage the students in that conversation as much as possible. I absolutely agree with Lee in terms of the importance of metacognition and the teachers not holding all the information and knowing all the stuff and not sharing it. You can say, okay, we've had a look at our skills audit. We think we're going to focus on this, 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 and this, because that's where you guys are telling us that you want the most support. So I think it's really involving students and other colleagues in that conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think,
and good luck as well.
Yeah, I think also this sense of what's the support like at home. You know, what resources do they have available to them, and how well can they use them, and what's the parental support or not. As well, to help them on this journey, because clearly not being in front of you, so much more is going on around them that you're not aware of. And it's this sort of these other worlds that the students are in, which you can't really influence, or you have very little influence over, which will potentially get in the way. So this sense of, are they ready to learn, and some of the things that Jamie's been talking about, and what support have they got in their class, in their home, you know, and where they are. I think you need to know that and find that out about every single student.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Lee and Jamie, for your really useful presentations. You've inspired us today, and we were delighted and very, very grateful to you for giving us your time. I'm just going to finish off now because we have run a little bit over time. I'd like to ask you to please remember to share this webinar recording with your colleagues at your schools. The recorded version will be available early next week on the Secondary English Network page. As BSME members, you are also eligible to watch the webinars in any of the networks, including Teaching and